What's up, Wildcatters? Welcome back to another episode of the Oil and Gas Startups podcast. I'm excited today because we get to talk about something that's like we don't really get to talk about too often. I don't think we have had many companies on the show that do robotics. Actually, as I'm thinking back, I can't think of a single one that does robotics, especially as it pertains to the oil field. So we've got Fred, we've got Joel with, I think it's Applied Impact Robotics, right?
Yep, that's it.
You said you're out of Washington, D.C. How the hell did you get into
Yeah,
how did you get into the oil and gas space?
that's a really good question. Yeah, so I'm in Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C., and I have a really strong robotics background. I've been doing stuff for with drones as well as the energy industry, mostly in clean tech. So, a lot of wind turbines, solar, and that type of
Mhm.
thing. So, not new to the energy industry, but certainly oil and gas is not something you think of when you think of Virginia. So, the way this got started for us was Petronas decided this was a really important topic for them, trying to find in-service inspections of crude oil tanks.
Mhm.
Trying to eliminate the confined space entry, reduce costs, and then reduce or eliminate the VOC emissions. So they typically would only work with large companies like GE to do a development effort like this. And they decided, hey, we want to find some small companies that can do some innovative things, but as an organization, we don't know how to do that. And so how can we find these pockets of innovation? And so what they did is they're an LP of a Chrysalix Venture Capital, and they said, hey, Chrysalix, can you help us find this? And so what they
Mhm.
did is they collaborated and came up with what they wanted to do, and then they ended up hosting it on HeroX.com, which is it's a crowdsourcing site, and that's ultimately where I found out about it. And
Was it kind of like, hey, we have this problem. Here's a bounty.
yep,
Go and
yep,
solve it. And was there like any kind of like seed capital on the line, or was it a
yeah. So
contract?
they put
Or
up a $250,000 bounty if you had a good idea, and that's really all we had at that point. Was they sort of described what sludge was. I'd never seen sludge. I'd never even seen a tank in person before,
Mhm.
right? And so I'm coming up with ideas for an industry I haven't been around and seen the tank. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. But yeah, we came up with an idea and actually ended up winning that proposal and that bounty. And that was like October, November of 2019. And they said, "Hey, here's this bounty, and we'll let that bounty go for 12 months, and take your proposal and try and validate that some of these technical concepts work. And if it works, then Chrysalix will follow on with some seed round of investment and take it further." Of course, COVID hit and made a big mess of things, and sort of the space we were using for some of the R&D kind of locked us out because they closed because of COVID. And so there's a lot of changes had to happen during that time. But we worked through all of that, and um, we're able to validate some of the technical aspects of this and actually show that some of the most difficult aspects of working in a crude tank, specifically operating a robot inside of sludge and sediment, it looks like we can do that. And so in February of 2021, we were actually able to close our seed round of funding, and that gave us an opportunity to bring on Joel, and got a 4,000 square foot R&D office in Virginia now, and bring on some additional technical staff and really take this to the next level. And it brought us here as well.
That's wild. Yeah, it's like you don't really hear many stories like that where it's like people who come from outside the industry.
Yep.
But what I like about it is that sometimes it provides a very unique perspective of how you kind of approach these kind of problems, right? This is kind of an age-old problem. So as I understand, what you're doing is you're building these robots. I don't know if these are necessarily autonomous, like kind of like a Roomba, or if these are like driven by somebody, which we can get into, but going into tanks, aka confined space, to be able to clean up sludge.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming it's probably more efficient, probably more cost effective, and then definitely more safe than sending people in there.
Yeah. So part of the reason, sort of that outside perspective, there's existing robots in the industry that work in product tanks, so things like diesel tanks
Mhm.
and jet fuel tanks and that type of thing. And most of those robots are like a tank tread style or wheeled type of robot. Maybe they have magnets on the wheel, something along those lines, right? And it's not hard to move inside of jet fuel or something. It's just like water, right? So um, and what happened was they've been very successful with that, and they said, okay, well, we were successful there, how about we take that robot and try and move it into sludge and see what we can do there. And it's failed for years and years it's failed because what works in water does not work in sludge. It's just completely different.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit from more of a technical perspective of like
Yeah.
why doesn't it work?
Yeah. So
without getting too technical, okay? Like I've never built a robot before, so
yeah. So the sludge, it's really, really thick, right? So you've got heavy sediment and sand, and crude oil has all kinds of garbage that comes up with it, everything from water and waxes, and the waxes take the oil and it sort of congeals into this sludge, right? And trying to sort of push through that sludge, there's almost no amount of power that you can put into a robot to just brute force your way through it. And that's really what the industry had been trying to do for years. Like, well, this company did this much power. We're going to add 50% more power and we'll get through this time. And it just didn't work. And mostly they were taking adaptations of sort of these product tank robots. And so our sort of key to success here is saying, hey, look, you can't power through sludge. It's just too thick to push through. So we're taking oil from higher in the tank and injecting it around our robot and then vibrating the robot. And by vibrating the shell of the robot, all of that hard packed material, all of the particles in there, as they vibrate, it starts to separate those particles apart. And then you inject fluid in between those particles. And what happens is it creates a significant reduction in the viscosity around the robot. So we're seeing around an 80% reduction in viscosity.
So are these tanks full when the robot's in there? Are these tanks
Exactly.
empty?
Yep. So you haven't drained the oil, you haven't drained the sludge.
Okay, I was imagining that they drained the tanks out and you were going in doing possible inspections on.
Nope. You didn't have to modify the tank in any way, right? And so we'll actually go in through the
and I'm assuming that we don't send people in there with full tanks, right?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay. I just had to clarify.
Get your scuba gear
So
ready.
traditionally you would have to drain the tank, send somebody
Yeah.
in, do some kind of inspections, kind of some sludge.
Yep.
But now you're not having to avoid. You're able to avoid kind of any sort of call it downtime.
Traditionally,
in the tank.
you would drain out all of the oil that you possibly can, and then you have to degas the chamber. Once you've drained all the oil, you're still left with the sludge, the sediment, and some gases. And so you basically pull off and vent all those gases and burn off all the gas that you can, and that leaves just the sludge and crud. And then depending on how high it is, a lot of times they'll actually cut a hole in the side of the tank and they'll basically like drive in excavators and scoop this stuff out. Because you can imagine some of these tanks are having 4 foot, 7 foot worth of sediment. You can imagine a 300-foot diameter tank. I mean, that's literally a mountain of sludge. And so there's environmental concerns. What do you do with all that? While you have the tank cut open, there's a lot of VOC emissions, and then confined space entry. So there's a lot of reasons it's dangerous.
How big is this thing?
Tanks are as much as 300 foot diameter. So, I mean, you can easily fit a football field in there easily.
No, I mean, how big are the robots?
Oh, the robots. So we're still in the R&D phase. So it's the final size isn't done, but it's probably going to be in the neighborhood of around, 12, 14 inches diameter. And so our solution is it's round with like a auger in the front. So it's using an auger to basically pull its way through.
What's an auger?
Like a drill, basically.
So that essentially almost like a reverse propeller in a way?
Think of like a boat propeller, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that it pulls itself through the sludge.
Yep.
Is it being driven by somebody? Is it?
So sort of, I wouldn't quite call it full autonomous, right? You wouldn't just like let it go and do its thing like a Roomba, right? But at the same time, someone's not going to be sitting there with the joysticks driving the thing all the time, right? So it's more like you would do some path planning and say, hey, I want the robot to go from here to here. And then you sort of monitor its progress as it goes. And then sort of as you go and collect all of the floor data looking for corrosion on the floor, you'd say, okay, that data looked good. Now let me plan the next test. And you'd typically go plate by plate in the floor.
So you said that it's pulling oil from up top, injecting it down, lowers the viscosity. So there is some sort of tether. Are you also along that tether? Are you tethering power as well?
Yeah. So we're tethering power, data, and then again, we'll have a pump that pulls oil from higher and then injects that around the robot. So those are the three things we'll have in the robot.
Okay. And so I'm guessing you're not like, is it actual like camera visibility, or you guys just have
No,
like sensors
there's no
or
visibility
data?
in crude oil and sludge.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Yeah, so we're actually using UT sensors. So the traditional way you would do this is you would drain all the oil, remove all the sludge, steam clean the whole thing so it's perfectly clean, and then you'd send a manned crew in there, and they do a magnetic flux leakage test, which is a quantitative, a qualitative scan. So basically, you're looking at an area and seeing how much metal is in that area, and if it's coming back showing like there's a little bit of loss, then there's probably a problem in that area. But it's sort of a really generalized scan, and then they do a UT scan, which gives you the quantitative data,
Mhm.
which is super accurate. But you're usually just going to do like small areas with that. And the reason you don't do the whole floor with UT and get those high resolution scans is it just takes too long. There's too much cost sensitivity. There's too much pressure to get the tank back in service. And that's part of the value of what we're doing is we're going to do UT scans over the entire floor.
So on one of these larger tanks, how long does this process? How long did it traditionally take, and then how long does it take with you guys?
So a traditional tank turnaround, because we're not going to compare scan to scan. So a traditional scan would only maybe take a day or two. However, it took you a lot of time to drain the oil, get rid of the sludge, and do all that. So it's anywhere from, say, 2 months on the short side to a year if things have kind of not gone well. So call it 3-4 months would be typical turnaround time for a tank to do all of that sludge removal, do the scans, and if you found some issues, then order the materials, bring in a crew, make those repairs, and then get the tank back online. And we're looking at somewhere around maybe 10 days to do a scan.
It's huge.
And again, not taking the tank out of service during that time. So.
I imagine, I have no clue what the actual number is, but I would imagine there's a shitload of tanks. I know there is. I just don't know exactly how big that number actually is.
Yeah, it depends on. It's a little bit of a tricky thing to come up with, but there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 tanks out there, and then
for the large crude oil tanks.
So crude oil tanks tend to be about 120 foot diameter to about 300 foot diameter. Usually anything smaller is usually product tanks, like the 80, 60 foot, 80 foot stuff is usually a fire water tank or diesel or jet fuel or something like that. So, but the 120 foot to 300 foot is usually the crude oil. For a variety of reasons, there's some tanks that can't be inspected with robots. Maybe the roof design doesn't give us appropriate access or something like that. So there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 40,000 tanks that we could actually potentially service.
What's up, Joel? You being quiet over there?
What's going on, man? How are you?
Good. So you came on board earlier this year, leading the sales and marketing efforts.
Yeah, that's right. So I've been with the company about 60 days so far. Been talking with Fred for quite some time, but brought me on to do sales and marketing. I come from an oil and gas background, kind of focused in new technology and bring in automation to the industry. So that's my focus. And actually got connected with Fred through a previous customer of mine, and they were looking for somebody to bring on board to, in Texas, based down here, had those connections. And so that's how it got started.
Still a good old boy network.
That's right.
Kind of pays to know who you know. So I'm curious about the business model. Is this a service base, or are you guys going in and obviously, since it's not autonomous, you're having to operate these as well. So there's somewhat of a service element to that. Is there any other kind of secondary business models in terms of selling these, in terms of leasing these? Kind of curious.
Yeah, so we're looking to integrate with customers directly, and although as you look at tanks, sort of from the 1,000-foot view, all the tanks look the same, right? They're all just big, round, white things, right? But when you get into the nitty-gritty details, what you find is every asset owner has developed their own tanks in their own way. They have different access and different standard operating procedures and different roof designs and that type of thing. So we're really working hard to integrate with the customers and their specific standard operating procedures. And then they'll become a direct customer of ours. And then since we really don't have the operational experience doing the inspections, being on site and that type of thing, some of the safety components, looking to sort of to subcontract and outsource the actual inspection. So we would bring we would get the contract with the asset owner, and then bring the robot to the table, and then subcontract that with some of the existing inspection companies.
Yeah, and one of the things that he was alluding to there, you never work in the oil and gas industry, you never want to shake things up too much. If you can imagine, these companies have been doing the same things the same way for years. So they generally have one contractor that does inspections for all of their tanks. They like to keep that constant. So that's one of the things, we don't want to try to tackle that barrier there of convincing them that we could do an inspection for them. It'd be much easier just to provide the tool to the inspection company they're already using, and then them use that tool to provide the data.
Mm-hmm. So you think you guys ever get to the point where you're educating kind of the end users on how to actually run the inspections? Or is that a little bit too technical?
Yeah, I'm not sure we're educating them. It's more working with them to understand their specific safety protocols. Of course, there's some things that are federally mandated, and there's APIs, regulations that need to be followed. But most asset owners are going to take those regulations and then add their flavor to it and their spin on it, and so it's more integrating with them as opposed to trying to educate them. But they're, you were asking about sort of ancillary things. The fact that we can go into a tank at irregular intervals is a big advantage, right? So right now, if you want to know what the state of the tank is, the only way to do that is to completely take it down, remove the oil, remove the sludge, and do all, take it out of service for months, right? We can actually go in and do, if you want, and typically they would do that every 10 years. That's sort of the API 653 mandate that sort of governs the inspections for these tanks. So they're typically going to take them down every 10 years. But if they want to know what it is, it's say 5 years, 6 years, sort of get these midpoint intervals, we can come in and do that and keep the tank in service while they do that.
So let's go back a little bit to this competition. I think this is really interesting. What was the website called again?
Our website's appliedimpactrobotics.com.
For the competition.
Oh, competition. HeroX.com. And it's a
HeroX?
Yep.
Is that energy specific? Is that like robotic specific? Is this?
No. It's just crowdsourced challenges of any and all kinds. Department of Energy tends to be really big there. So they have all kinds of challenges related to desalination, to generating energy from waves, to solar energy. So they tend to be a big poster on there.
I'm just finding a whole bunch of things on League of Legends and Minecraft. Is it
no
HeroAX?
Just HeroX.
Oh, okay. That's why.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Common mistake.
Okay, so you go in here and it's companies coming in and saying, is it mostly companies or is it also just organizations?
It can be organizations. Again, there's a lot of government agencies that are getting involved. So traditionally, if a government agency like Department of Energy, NIST, Department, Bureau of Reclamation, something like this, if they want to give out money, traditionally a grant, and a grant would usually be in the form of like an SBIR or STTR. This is how they would issue a grant. Commonly, these phase one grants are in the $100,000 to $200,000 range. There's a tremendous amount of overhead that goes into all of this, right? They want to make sure there's no fraud happening. So if you got handed a grant, you would have to do a tremendous amount of accounting work and reporting to them to make sure you're using the money the way you said you were going to use it. And if you're paying employees, you have to define what that employee's role is, and then make sure you're not paying them more than what someone else in that role in industry is. And so there's a ton of back end work, both on your side
blockchain fixes
and on the government side. So they're handing you, say, $100,000, but there was, on the government side, maybe $300,000 worth of administration work happening. And they realized this is just not an efficient way to do these things. And on the company side, they're spending so much money to do all this reporting that a good chunk of the money never went towards the innovation. And they realized that that's just not a good way to do things. So they started giving the money out as prizes instead of grants. And by giving it out as prize money, it knocks down all those barriers. All the money can go towards innovation. And so HeroX is the mechanism for them to give out that money and award these prizes. And so Chrysalix sort of leveraged this and got on there and posted the Petronas Chrysalix tank.
So you just been on this website, or did you hear about this specific challenge, or kind of how did that come about?
A friend of mine, a co-founder.
Okay.
Yeah, Jade Garrett's a co-founder, and she actually found it on the website and said, "Hey, Fred, let's do this thing." And I think we found out about it 3 days before the submission date, and so it was like a long weekend, and we basically spent all weekend just researching the oil and gas industry, which we had no experience with, and just writing up a proposal, which we kind of did as mostly a goof. We're like, we're not going to win. We're just a couple friends sitting in like a dining room, writing a proposal. We'll never win this thing.
So what were you doing at the time?
Product development with robotics. Okay. Yeah, prior to this, people would hire me for developing all kinds of robots for, wind turbine sensor networks and, drones for, Army's applied impact, our Army's applied impact labs, or Army's, research, or applied research lab. So yeah, mostly product development, mostly with robotics and Internet of Things devices.
So you guys win, you're like, oh shit, like now we have to do something, right?
Yeah.
So they give you this money. Is it looked at, I know she said prize money, but is it looked at kind of like seed money? Do they work alongside any of these kind of, VC funds or?
Yeah. So like this was, again, this money came from VC, not from Department of Energy or something. So this wasn't quite straight prize money. And so in our case, it was a SAFE, which is that's
simple agreement for future equity.
There you go.
There we go.
My man. Yep. Yep. So yeah, we took it in the form of a SAFE, and then they said, hey, we'll convert that SAFE if you do anything that's worthy, and we'll move forward with a seed funding round. And and again, we landed that back in February.
Nice. So you guys were like, okay, so I guess we're going to structure a company around this. So you had your co-founder that you were kind of getting around the dining room table with.
Yep.
Was there anybody else that was kind of involved early on?
No, early on it's just the two of us, and throughout basically the sort of first year when we were working on with that SAFE money, it's pretty much just the two of us. And then as we landed the seed investment, that was when it moved to a point where we could actually get a proper, robotics R&D office and, hire on some folks like Joel who have some experience in the oil and gas industry and help start making the connections to some of the oil majors that are starting to engage with us and support us.
So I would imagine that robotics is quite expensive to kind of get off the ground, right? To be able to build these types of units. So for that first year, was it kind of just coming up with the specifications for a prototype? Was it actually going out and sourcing various parts? Like, walk us through that, because I've actually came from a hardware background, built some very like not crazy robotics back in my day, before switching over to software, before switching over to oil and gas.
Yep.
Parts can be expensive, right?
Yeah.
Seems like you have a lot of experience there. So kind of walk me through like that process, that whole first year. You guys have the safe money. Like, what are you actually doing?
Yeah. So the first thing for us was to recognize that for this amount of money and this amount of time, you can't build a whole robot and do everything, right? So you have to break it down into the functional areas that you need to do. So first thing is, can you modify the sludge, right? Can you actually modify it to do something? Once you can, then the next thing is, okay, if you can modify it, can you propel through it? Okay, if you can propel through it, can you actually maneuver, like change directions and orientations? Once you're at the bottom of the tank, can you take a UT measurement? If you can do, at the bottom of the tank, taking a reading, but not knowing where you're at as a problem. So, okay, well, now you need to do localization. So you sort of break the project into all of these functional areas, right? And then assign some sort of risk factor to them, right? What's the hardest problem in here? And start talking with industry and say, hey, which one of these pieces of the development would get you most excited? If I solved this thing here, that would get you really spun up about what we're doing. And so pretty much everyone said, okay, well, things like localization, robots have been localizing themselves for a long time. That's kind of a solvable thing, right? It's not easy.
So
but
during
it's
this
solvable.
process, you're having kind of direct communication with the people who kind of put up the bounty.
Yeah.
So do you have a little bit of feedback loop of like, hey, what are we actually solving for?
Exactly.
So you're not just in a silo at the kitchen table just trying to figure this shit out by yourself.
Petronas was an important part of that because again, they came with the idea and they were sort of our introduction into the industry and what's in a tank and why is this important.
I think, you could probably elaborate a little more, but that's a huge advantage for startups, right? Is like the industry came to Fred and HeroX with the challenge. So, they didn't have to spend that time validating the value of the robotics. The industry had already done that, right? So I think they already had pretty much a head start there and we're building something that the industry would adopt and would use.
Yep.
So, once we identified, sort of broke the robot into the functional areas, right? We said, okay, what's the most important to solve? And the answer was moving through sludge. They're like, hey, we've never seen someone move through sludge. So if you can do that, we'd be really excited about that. And so that was what we focused on. Sort of all the rest of it just sort of slid to the right. And all of our focus went to that. And that's what basically got everyone excited towards moving to the seed round, right? So it's sort of this cycle of figuring out what's the most important to the customer, getting the customer excited, seeing that the customer is excited, gets the venture capital excited, venture capital feeds us money, and then in this iterative cycle, and it's the next stage. Okay, we made that work. Now what's the next thing that would get you excited? And then we make that work. That gets VC excited, more money, and keep sort of doing this cycle. Right?
So where you guys are at now, you said you're working on the prototype. Like, where are you kind of at in the life cycle of that, and like what's next?
Yeah, in the life cycle right now, so we're able to demonstrate that we can modify the viscosity of sludge. So we can, we're seeing right around an 80% decrease in the viscosity by using a combination of that vibration and fluid injection. And then we've been able to demonstrate that by using an auger, sort of think of like a modified like screw or modified um, like a boat prop. So we're sort of swimming through the sludge as opposed to trying to crawl on the bottom. So we're kind of swimming around in the tank through the sludge. That we can actually get an auger that's a correct design and RPM and able to use that reduced viscosity and propel ourselves through it. So some of the things that we're working towards right now is now that everyone started to see, hey, we can actually get to the bottom. They believe we can get to the bottom now. Now the question is, can you take a UT reading? And traditional UT is done in a fairly clean environment. And we're looking to do it inside of sludge and sediment in an in-service environment. And that's a very non-traditional way of doing it. And so we've got some ideas around that, and we're proving that we can do that now. So that's sort of our next proof point.
What are your, like, where do you think is, like, kind of zooming out, side tangent, robotics as a whole, as it kind of, plays into kind of our everyday lives, right? So you've seen like basic things like Roombas, but now I'm seeing like full size industrial, like industrial equipment. We have a ranch up in, up outside of Dallas, And so I see these things and I'm kind of interested, potentially as that kind of continues to grow, do we invest in, for example, my dad spends an enormous amount of time mowing, right?
Yep.
So now they have these gigantic industrial Roombas essentially that just go out and mow acres and acres and acres and acres of land.
Yep.
And now they have like these other robots that go through and like shoot these lasers to kind of like prime like for crops and for various other things. So like, what are your thoughts on like where do we go kind of as a society with robots over say the next like 5 years? And like, what are you excited about?
There's a ton of really exciting stuff happening. I mean, you're starting to see things like drone deliveries starting to take shape. People are doing that type of thing. You're starting to see urban mobility, right? Dense urban areas. You're starting to see, like, think of like Uber in the skies, right? So you're starting to see basically a big drone that can fit like 1 or 2 people. So some companies doing that type of thing. And then obviously companies like Tesla doing some pretty exciting things. I mean, this is all autonomous vehicle type thing. You're starting to see it in, Caterpillar and industrial equipment is starting to see more and more automation. Started slowly, you'd see GPS integrated so you could, track a certain line better. And now it's slowly turning into full automation, inspection. So anything that has, the 3Ds, the dirty, dull, and dangerous jobs, right? Those are sort of ripe for innovation. In clean energy, we were doing stuff with drones and inspection of wind turbine blades and things like that. So I think there's a ton of areas where there's a lot of innovation that can and is taking place.
So I had this idea that one summer I started this like side business, right? I was bored. I wanted to kind of pay down some of my college loans. So I started pressure washing.
Yep.
And I got on the Nextdoor app. Nobody knows this story. I don't think I've ever really told this. I got on the Nextdoor app, which is like your neighborhood and stuff. And I didn't have any pressure washers. And I said, hey, I realize all you have some dirty ass driveways. Like, who wants to get their driveways pressure washed?
Yeah.
And are you willing to pay this price? And I had 45 responses. And I was like, oh shit. So I went and bought 2 pressure washers. And I just started going out and just pressure washing.
Yep.
And that turned into like this thing for like a long time, making a ton of side cash, just pressure washing. It was the most therapeutic thing ever too. So it was so funny. But I've always had this idea, like driving through Houston, especially where it's, it's very humid. There's lots of mildew, and some of the most beautiful buildings in Houston are just absolutely covered in mildew in places that you aren't really going to go put a person in pressure wash because it doesn't make sense. Like, could you tether essentially a water line onto an industrial sized drone to be able to pressure wash buildings and bridges and like other really odd things, right? Because over time, I would imagine that mildew does actually break down some of the materials that it's on. Yep. It does cause corrosion. So being able to, that's one use case, being able to like actually, if you can counteract the shooting of, the water, right, while it's in flight. But also if you could do that, you could also paint too. So imagine you could paint entire buildings. Like the last building that we were in downtown, literally these guys outside painting this whole building by hand. Watch them do the entire thing. Like you could speed that up so much faster if you could just, and that's probably a lot easier because I don't think you need as much PSI to paint as you do to pressure wash. But like applications like that, I think could be
so the problems you just described, right, are the exact same challenge you find in infrastructure inspection. So pressure washing or painting or inspecting, say, a bridge, it's all the same challenge, which is how do you get a drone or device to interact with the environment without hitting anything? So you have obstacle detection, obstacle avoidance, navigation, and these are exactly the challenges the Tesla is working on, right? Like, how do you maintain your lane? What if a person jumps out, or if there's a dog runs across the street? These are all complicated things. And if you look at all of the major companies, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Google, Amazon, Tesla, name a company, they're all working on all of the core things that would unlock the things that you're talking about right there. They're all working on it. And if you go back to HeroX, Lockheed Martin ran a thing. They put up a $1 million bounty. So have you ever seen the little 250 size racing drones? They've shown them on ESP.
Those are fast.
Yeah, they're super fast.
Usually they put on some sort of goggles to actually like to drive them.
Yeah, the first person view goggles. So they put up a $1 million bounty to have a drone fly autonomously through one of those courses. If you could develop a drone, because that speaks to, if you can make that work, then that starts to unlock all the things that you were talking
And
about.
Northrop
right?
Grumman doing it. So what are they thinking about? How do we weaponize these things? Or was Lockheed?
It was Lockheed, yeah. Yeah.
I worked on a lot of Lockheed equipment because I did communications in the Marine Corps. So like they're thinking about how do we either one, add comms to it, or two, how do we weaponize it, or three, ideally both.
I'm sure they have some thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Dude, imagine that, like you're in an area and all of a sudden like this army of like weaponized drones comes over the hill. Like,
well, think about trying to fly a drone through, say, the woods, right?
Yeah.
And you have it sort of weave in and out of the trees. And that's a really hard problem. And so, yeah, basically everyone today is working on that, and a lot of edge computing and that type of thing to unlock that capability. So it's getting there, and there's some really interesting stuff around it.
Yeah.
But it's not quite to like the DIY maker level where like a smart guy in his garage could just like, knock something out in a few weeks and be like, here's this wonderful drone that does, bridge painting or something like that.
I will say that the barriers to entry for all these things are just becoming so much lower. We have a Mavic drone that we use just to record videos and stuff, and we were joking about just running that one into the side of a wall, so we had a reason to buy the new one that just came out, which is a 5K or 6K cinema camera built into it.
Yep.
And you look at the video footage from that, and that's completely disrupting the film industry. Like things that you just could not do as like just an independent filmmaker. Now it's like, for $1,000, $2,000, whatever, anybody can do it.
Yep.
It's absolutely wild. I love technology. I love drones. I love robots. I'm so excited to see, like, does it turn into iRobot one day? That's what I'm curious about.
We'll find out. Only time will tell.
Right? Oh shit. Well, guys, really enjoyed this conversation. If anybody's interested in kind of reaching out to you guys, the website's appliedimpactrobotics.com.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. And then you guys are both on LinkedIn. We'll put links to your profiles on the show notes. Guys, thanks for making the trip. Thanks for making the trip down from DC.
Appreciate you having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely excited for you guys. I guess take 2 seconds and I don't know, go check out our website. It's new. That's the only thing I'm gonna say today. Catch you on the next episode.